I receive a flood of messages from students who take the LSAT and then, when scores come out, they feel blindsided. Not because the test feels terrible for them, not because they froze, but because their official LSAT score comes back 10, 15, even 20 points lower than their practice test average. And if that happens to you, you are not alone and you are not crazy. Today, I'm going to break down what might actually be happening behind these surprising LSAT score drops, especially with the shifting LSAT curve. Here's the first thing we need to talk about when it comes to all these horror stories, specifically selection bias. And I know that selection bias sounds like a stats class term, but the simple version is when someone takes the LSAT and gets exactly what they expected, they don't go on Reddit and write a 10-paragraph breakdown about it. Nobody writes a post titled, "I scored what I thought I would," feeling meh. That post gets 0 upvotes. People also rarely post when they exceed expectations. Maybe they do once in a while, but positive experiences don't spread as fast or as wide as negative ones. That is just human psychology and social media dynamics. But when someone's score drops 20 points below their practice test average, that is shocking and it's unsettling. And it's the kind of thing people rush online to post about. So the first thing I want you to understand is this. Online chatter amplifies the extreme cases. I'm talking about the big drops, the weird results, and the LSAC conspiracy theories, but it doesn't actually reflect what's happening to the LSAT population as a whole. If your friend scored exactly their practice test average, you're not going to hear about it online. And if a majority of students match their practice test range, you're not going to hear about that either. You're only going to hear from the outliers. Now, there's this rumor going around that LSAC has made the LSAT harder, maybe to balance out the people who took the old LSAT with logic games, and that theory floats around all over the place. And my honest take is that it's not really likely, but it's also not totally impossible either. Logic games were easier for some students to perfect and they were harder for others. And so replacing logic games with a second score logical reasoning section helps some students, but it also hurts others. And that could, of course, even out. It could be a wash. And there's also been a lot of LSAT score inflation in recent years. And so LSAC could be adjusting the scale to compensate. And that is probably the biggest factor here, LSAC looking to adjust the curve, because the temporary LSAT flex format led to shorter tests, less fatigue, and higher scores. And LSAC has also significantly increased the number of students receiving accommodations for extra time, extra breaks, or both. So LSAT medians have skyrocketed as a result, and this is measurable. You can see this in the ABA 509 reports. Every single T14 law school now reports median LSAT scores of 170 or higher. And that is unprecedented. A couple of years back, a 173 put you solidly in the 99th percentile. Now, you've got to hit a 175 to be in that same percentile. And that shift alone tells you something major is happening with LSAT scoring. And so when score inflation gets out of control, LSAC has to respond by adjusting the scale, the so-called curve. This is the raw score conversion into a scaled score out of 180. And when that scale tightens, there are fewer wrong answers, separating a 168 from a 160 or from a 174 from a 166. So if you felt fine on test day, but 2 or 3 questions went sideways in each section, that could now produce a dramatically lower score than you were expecting. Not because you forgot how to take the LSAT, but because the bar has been raised. And of course, I know this feels unfair, and you might be thinking about retaking in January or February. And of course, if LSAC did tighten the scale this aggressively, and if they did it pretty quickly, that's not really fair because, of course, you've been studying probably for months, maybe years in some cases, based on historical expectations from the previously released LSAT practice tests. And I know it could feel disorienting or feel personal if your score comes back lower than you were thinking, but the hard truth is that it is what it is. Complaining isn't going to help you. Instead, we got to look ahead. So maybe you're retaking in January or February or even April, maybe even June. And if you are prepping for a retake, you're going to need a different strategy than what you used before. The new LSAT requires mastery of the hardest questions. That is the consequence of the scale getting tightened. You can't just get better at the intermediate difficulty questions because everybody gets those. The biggest differentiator now is how well can you handle the hardest logical reasoning questions on the exam. Students might crush the mid-range questions, the ones, say, numbered 15 in a section, but the questions numbered 20, 22, 24, the top-end difficulty ones, those are mattering more than ever, especially because logical reasoning is 2/3 of your score, and so any gains you make in your understanding of logical reasoning will be doubled across those two sections. And so if you're retaking in January or February in particular, your prep at this point should be focusing on identifying the 3 or 4 hardest logical reasoning question types for you, drilling the hardest variants of those question types, learning to spot trap patterns instantly, tightening your reasoning precision, and reviewing every single mistake with microscopic levels of detail. You don't need more practice tests, you just need better analysis of those tests that you are taking. So this could involve working on parallel reasoning questions, technical science questions, more abstract questions on philosophy, morality, aestheticism, whatever your least favorite type is, maybe that's what you've got to focus on. And if your score comes back and it's shockingly low, you might be thinking to yourself of getting a score audit. They offer score audits for, I think, $150. And that's a throwback to the old Scantron era when human error was more common. But because the LSAT's now fully digital, the chances of LSAC miscalculating your score are pretty unlikely. But if your score was so far outside your practice test range that it feels truly impossible, meaning your practice test average was a 170 and you scored a 150, you might want to consider the score audit just for peace of mind. But there are 2 important caveats when it comes to requesting a score audit. If your score changes as a result of that audit, whether it is higher or lower, the new score is final. You don't get to choose, and you cannot appeal it again. And almost every single audit ends up confirming the original score. So don't expect miracles for this. Do it only for peace of mind if you're truly sure that your PT average was way higher than what your score ultimately came back as. Now, if your score did drop, it doesn't mean you suddenly got worse at the LSAT or that your law school dreams are over, but you've got to look ahead now. If you are retaking in January or February, focus again on the hardest logical reasoning questions, review more deeply, anticipate tighter scaling. This curve is less forgiving than it used to be, and you've got to trust that you are capable of adjusting. Your LSAT score is not a measure of your self-worth. It's just a snapshot of your reasoning under pressure on a particular day. And while the LSAT as a whole is incredibly important, no one particular test date will make or break you because you can always retake. You can retake it in January or February. February and January are both not too late for this cycle, and it's well worth applying a couple months later with a higher score than in November with a lower score. And so if your PT average was higher than what you got on your LSAT administration today, when scores come back, know that it is worth retaking. If you can put another 6 weeks or maybe 10 weeks at worst, you can still apply this cycle, and it's probably worth delaying your applications for that.